In every city, there are masajid where hearts find peace, where believers gather in the name of Allah, and where the sound of Quran fills the air like light filling the darkness. Yet, among these houses of Allah, there are some that carry stories whispered from tongue to tongue, tales that awaken both awe and fear. This is one such story, a reminder that the unseen world is real and that not all who walk among us are from mankind. There was a masjid, ordinary in its structure, yet extraordinary in its reputation. People prayed there daily, but quietly they spoke of strange things that would happen. Some said that when the imam would recite, echoes would answer back though the masjid was nearly empty. Others mentioned hearing footsteps when no one was behind them. At times, shadows seemed to move along the walls, though no person walked in that direction. The elders would warn the youth. This masjid has its own mysteries. Do not take it lightly. Oh, yet, despite these whispers, the people continued to gather there. For them, the call of Salah was stronger than fear. They knew this was the house of Allah, a place where no harm could reach except by His will. Still, the atmosphere inside carried a weight, as though unseen eyes were watching. The air would sometimes grow heavy during the late-night prayers, and worshippers would glance over their shoulders without knowing why. One man recalled standing in prayer alone after Usha. As he bent into sujud, he heard another voice whisper the takbir beside him, though no one had entered. Another spoke of feeling the rows beside him fill with a presence, though when he opened his eyes, the space remained empty. The more people tried to ignore these signs, the more undeniable they became. The scholars of that town reminded the people, the jinn are real. They live among us, though unseen. Some are Muslim and some are not. The Quran itself speaks of them. Do not let your hearts tremble in fear, for the believer is stronger when he holds onto the remembrance of Allah. These words comforted the congregation, but curiosity remained. If these happenings were true, what awaited them in the depths of the night? It was not uncommon for travelers to stop at this masjid, for it was near the main road. Some would later say they felt a chill as they entered, as if the air shifted suddenly. Others admitted they avoided praying alone there after dark. Still, the masjid stood firm, and the people filled it daily, for who can abandon the Salah? There were those who dismissed the stories as imagination. Perhaps it is only the mind playing tricks, they said. But the number of witnesses was too many, and their experiences too consistent. The Imam himself admitted to moments where, during his recitation, it seemed as if unseen voices followed in harmony, then faded away like wind vanishing into silence. The strange part was that these events always happened in the middle of prayer, never outside. When people entered to rest or read Quran, the place was calm. But once the takbir was said and the Salah began, disturbances would occur. A sudden flicker of the lights, a noise from the back, a movement seen from the corner of the eye. It was as though the unseen world was drawn to the worship, unable to stay distant when the words of Allah were recited. The community began to accept this reality. They said, perhaps these are not enemies, but creatures of the unseen who come to listen. For had not Allah mentioned in the Quran that groups of jinn once gathered to hear the recitation of His words? Some were Muslim, who then returned to their people and said, "We have heard a wondrous Quran. Perhaps this masjid was one of those places where such gatherings continued." But among these thoughts was also caution. Not all jinn are righteous, and not all who gather come with good intentions. Fear mingled with faith, and faith kept the people standing firm. The atmosphere grew especially intense on certain nights when the imam would recite long shuras with deep concentration. Those who prayed behind him would later whisper that they felt more than human souls in that gathering. Some claimed they heard faint weeping, not from their brothers beside them, but from somewhere distant, as though the walls themselves carried sorrow. Still, no harm had come. The people continued their worship, trusting that the power of Quran was stronger than any shadow. Yet deep inside, everyone knew the day would come when the unseen would no longer remain hidden, when what was felt and heard would finally be seen. And that night was closer than they thought. The night that carried the weight of destiny came silently, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The masjid was quiet during the day, filled with the usual rhythm of Salah and Quran. Nothing seemed unusual, yet those who had prayed there for years felt something different in the air. It was as if an invisible veil had been drawn across the doors of the masjid, waiting for the right moment to reveal what lay behind it. It was the night of Isha, a night when the streets outside were hushed and the stars hung low in the sky. The call to prayer rose beautifully, echoing through the neighborhood, calling every heart to the house of Allah. Men left their homes, walking steadily toward the masjid. They spoke little that evening, some greeting one another quietly, others looking around as though expecting something unseen to pass them by. Their hearts longed for prayer, yet their souls carried an unspoken awareness that this night would not be like the others. Inside, the masjid was simple as always, clean mats spread neatly, soft light from the lamps, the faint scent of musk lingering in the air. Rows began to form, shoulders touched shoulders, and hearts prepared for Salah. Children sat at the back, whispering before being hushed by their fathers. The imam entered, his face calm, his voice steady as he prepared to lead the congregation. To any stranger, it was a normal night, an ordinary prayer. But to those who had grown accustomed to the subtle strangeness of this masjid, the air was far too heavy, as if something awaited in the silence. When the imam raised his hands and said, Allahu Akbar, the rows fell silent, each worshipper stepping into the sacred conversation with his Lord. The recitation began, soft at first, flowing like a river of peace. Surah after surah filled the masjid, echoing against the walls, resonating in the hearts. But as the words continued, something began to shift. The air grew colder, though the doors and windows were closed. A faint sound crept in, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. Yet there was no wind that night. The imam's voice remained strong, but those in the first row began to feel uneasy. From the corner of their eyes, shadows flickered, moving without form, yet too real to be ignored. A man in the second row blinked quickly, convinced he saw someone slip into the masjid from the side. But when he looked again, the spot was empty. Still, the prayer went on. None dared to break their salah, though hearts began to race and breaths grew shallow. Then came a sound, distinct and undeniable, the shuffle of feet across the back row. The worshippers knew no one had entered. Every man who came in was accounted for. Yet the steps moved slowly, deliberately, as if unseen figures were joining the congregation. A man at the end of the row nearly lost his balance, feeling a cold brush against his arm. He forced himself to remain still, whispering the verses in his heart with greater intensity. The imam's recitation grew louder, as though he too sensed the disturbance. His voice carried the words of Allah with strength, piercing through the strange heaviness that filled the masjid. But the signs only grew stronger. Some heard faint murmurs, like whispers in a language unknown. Others felt as though the rows beside them swelled with more worshippers, though their eyes showed only emptiness. The children at the back clung to one another, their small faces pale, sensing far more than the adults realized. One boy would later say he felt as if someone was standing right behind him, breathing softly, though when he looked, no one was there. Still, the prayer continued. The imam bowed into ruku and the congregation followed. In that moment of bending together, the sound came again. A voice, deep and echoing, reciting alongside the imam. It was not a human voice, not the tone of any man present. It carried a weight, a resonance that seemed to rise from the very floor of the masjid. The men froze in their hearts, though their bodies obeyed the movements of Salah. Their ears could not deny what they heard, an unseen being joining in the prayer. Fear began to grip some of them. The thought crossed their minds. Should they break the prayer? Should they flee? But the power of Salah held them rooted, reminding them that in the presence of Allah, no creation could harm them. The imam raised his head from ruku and continued the recitation. His voice was steady, as though challenging the unseen presence. He recited with such depth and clarity that the masjid seemed to tremble with the words. Those behind him felt strength return to their hearts. But just as calm began to settle, another disturbance swept through, a sudden movement, like a rush of wind across the rows, though the doors were shut tight. Robes swayed, hair lifted, and the air itself quivered. One man later swore he saw a figure, tall and shadowy, standing briefly in the far corner of the masjid before vanishing like smoke. Another said he saw shapes moving along the walls, figures with no faces, slipping in and out of sight. The whispers grew louder, circling the room, mixing with the imam's recitation in a way that made every heart pound. Yet still, no one broke their salah. Their bodies remained straight, their foreheads touched the ground, and their tongues recited the words of their Lord. It was as if the congregation had entered into a test, whether they would stand firm in the presence of the unseen, or whether fear would overcome their devotion. The imam's voice rose once more, carrying verses that spoke of the majesty of Allah, verses that reminded the living and the unseen alike of who holds power over all creation. The masjid seemed to shiver with every ayah. Slowly, the whispers began to fade, the shadows retreated, and the heaviness lifted just enough for the men to breathe again. Still, the feeling did not disappear entirely. Something remained, watching, waiting, unseen, but not gone. That night, the people knew the stories were true. The masjid was not only a place for men, it was a place where the unseen gathered, where the veil between worlds grew thin during prayer. And though they finished their salah in safety, the memory of that night etched itself into every heart. Because from that evening forward, no one could deny that the unseen were present, drawn to the words of Allah, standing among them in prayer, and all knew, in silence and awe, that what happened that night was only the beginning. The moment that changed everything came suddenly, as if the unseen had decided that silence and whispers were no longer enough. Until now, the worshippers had felt shadows, heard faint sounds, and sensed presences around them. But what unfolded on that night was something far beyond imagination. It was the moment when the hidden world revealed itself in a way no one present would ever forget. The imam's recitation filled the masjid, his voice steady and powerful. Every heart clung to the words, for they were the shield against the fear pressing down upon them. As the verses echoed, the air thickened once more. The lamps flickered, their light unsteady, casting long, shifting shapes on the walls. Men glanced quickly from the corners of their eyes, each one trying not to break focus, yet each one feeling that something was moving among them. Then it happened. Without warning, a sound rose. Not a whisper this time, not the shuffle of feet, but a deep, guttural voice that answered the imam's recitation. It was loud, so loud that it seemed to come from every corner of the masjid at once. It carried no warmth, no human tone, but a resonance that shook the hearts of those who heard it. Some later described it as though rocks grinding against one another had formed words. Others said it was like the roar of the earth itself. Whatever it was, every man present knew instantly. This was not the voice of any human being. The rows trembled. A man in the second row faltered, nearly breaking his prayer, but he forced himself to continue, his forehead dripping with sweat. Another felt his knees weaken, yet he held himself upright, fearing Allah more than he feared the unseen. The children at the back buried their faces into their fathers' garments, trembling in silence. The imam, however, did not stop. His voice grew firmer, reciting louder, almost as if he was confronting the unseen being directly. The Qur'an rang out against the otherworldly sound, verse against echo, light against shadow. And then, as though struck by the power of the words, a figure began to appear. At first it was a blur, a distortion of the air at the far end of the masjid. The worshippers squinted, their eyes refusing to believe, but the blur thickened, taking form. Slowly, the outline of a tall, towering figure emerged. It had no clear face, only darkness where features should have been. Its body stretched unnaturally, as though it were smoke trying to imitate the shape of a man. The light from the lamps bent around it, flickering wildly as if afraid to touch it. Gasps escaped from the rows, muffled by the discipline of Salah, but hearts beat like drums in the chests of the men. The presence of the jinn was undeniable now. It did not merely whisper, it stood before them, visible to their eyes, breaking the barrier that separated the worlds. Some later swore they saw its eyes, glowing faintly, like embers hidden in the dark. Others said its form shifted constantly, one moment tall, the next moment hunched, as though it could not decide what shape to hold. But all agreed on one thing: the masjid was no longer filled only with men. Something else had entered their rows. The imam continued reciting, his voice unwavering. His calmness was itself a miracle, for even the bravest among the congregation felt the urge to run. Yet no one moved. They remained in Salah, frozen not by fear, but by faith. They knew that if they left their prayer, they would lose the very shield that protected them. The jinn's presence grew heavier. The air pressed down on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. A sound like a low growl rumbled through the masjid, rising and falling with the imam's recitation. The worshippers could feel it vibrating in their bones. A man in the back row later confessed that he thought his heart would stop from the weight of it. Then, in a moment that none could ever forget, the jinn moved. Its form drifted slowly across the rows, its shadow stretching unnaturally, passing through the worshippers without touching them. Yet every man it passed felt a chill colder than ice run down his spine. They knew then that this was not imagination, not a trick of the mind. The unseen had entered their world openly, and it was walking among them. The imam's recitation grew louder, surah after surah flowing with force. His voice carried verses of power, verses that declared the greatness of Allah. The congregation felt the strength of the Quran surrounding them, pushing back against the darkness that loomed within the masjid. Yet the jinn did not vanish. It lingered, as though testing them, as though seeking a weakness in their hearts. Finally, as the imam recited a verse that spoke of the onness of Allah and the falsehood of those who turn away, the figure let out a sound that shook the very walls. It was not a scream, nor a laugh, but something between the two, a noise filled with fury and frustration. The lamps flickered violently, some nearly extinguishing, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath them. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved. Its body unraveled like smoke in the wind, fading into the air until nothing remained but silence. The masjid fell into stillness once more, but the silence was different now. It was heavy, sacred, as though every soul present had witnessed a truth they could never deny. The imam finished the prayer, his voice calm, his movements steady. When the final salam was given, the congregation sat in stunned quiet. None spoke at first, for words seemed too weak to capture what they had just experienced. Some wept quietly, not out of fear, but out of awe at the power of Allah's words. Others held their heads low, whispering daika to steady their trembling hearts. The children clung to their fathers, eyes wide, knowing they had seen what most people only hear about in stories. That night marked a turning point for everyone who prayed in that masjid. They had not only believed in the unseen, they had witnessed it with their own eyes. They had stood in Salah as a jinn revealed itself in the middle of their prayer, and they had remained firm. And though fear touched their hearts, it was faith that carried them through. From that day forward, no one ever entered that masjid without remembering the night when the veil was lifted, when the unseen stepped into the world of men, and when the Quran proved itself to be the strongest shield against all that lurks in darkness. When the prayer ended and the imam gave the final salam, the masjid did not erupt in whispers as it usually did. Instead, an overwhelming silence filled the space, heavier than the air before. Every man sat frozen, eyes lowered, hearts pounding, as though they feared that even speaking might call back what they had just witnessed. The jinn had revealed itself in the middle of Salah, and though its presence had dissolved, the weight of it remained in the hearts of those who were there. For a moment, no one dared to move. The imam remained seated, his lips moving softly in daika, his face calm, though his silence spoke volumes. Some of the men kept their eyes closed, as though still in prayer, unwilling to face the fear that had carved itself into their memories. Others stared blankly at the mats in front of them, their minds replaying what they had seen, the towering shadow, the glowing eyes, the sound that shook their very bones. The youngest of the congregation, those boys who had been at the back, clung to their fathers. Their small bodies trembled, their eyes wide with terror. A father whispered to his son, "Do not be afraid, my child. Allah is with us. No harm can come when we are in His protection." Yet his own voice shook as he spoke, betraying the fear he carried inside. One man, older and with years of worship behind him, broke the silence with a soft sob. Tears streamed down his face, not only from fear, but from awe. "Allahu Akbar," he whispered again and again. "Why have seen the truth of what we always believed. We have seen what the unseen truly means." His words lit a spark in the hearts of those around him, reminding them that what had happened was not a curse, but a sign. Still, the reactions were not all the same. Some were overcome with fear, their hands trembling as they struggled to steady themselves. They whispered to one another in hushed tones, "What if it comes again? What if it follows us home? What if we are not safe?" Their hearts were shaken, their minds unsettled by the thought that the unseen could manifest so openly. Others, however, felt a strange strength rise within them. They remembered the verses of Quran that had driven the jinn away. They remembered how, despite its terrifying form, it could not harm them. They remembered that it was the power of Allah's words, carried by the imam's voice, that had forced it to vanish. These men sat straighter, whispering dhikr with conviction, their fear turning into renewed faith. One man, seated near the front, lifted his hands and made dua. His voice trembled, but it carried a depth of sincerity that filled the masjid. "Why, Allah, protect us. Ya Allah, strengthen our hearts. Ya Allah, keep us steadfast in your worship." His words rippled through the congregation, and soon others raised their hands as well, their duas mingling together, rising like a shield of light against the darkness they had just witnessed. The imam finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Do not let your hearts be shaken," he said. "What you saw tonight is not greater than Allah. What you felt tonight cannot overpower His words. Remember this, the car is protection, and the one who holds firmly to it has nothing to fear from the unseen." His words steadied many, giving them the courage to breathe freely again. Yet, despite his reassurance, the faces of the men told a story of struggle. Some could not stop glancing at the corners of the masjid, half expecting the figure to return. Others wiped sweat from their brows, their bodies still trembling. The silence was broken only by soft whispers of tasbih and the occasional sob of someone overwhelmed by what had happened. The children, still shaken, asked questions in hushed voices. "Father, was that a man? Was it a ghost? Why did it come?" Their father struggled for answers, finally telling them, "It was from the jinn, and they too are creation of Allah. Do not fear them, for our strength is in Him." The boys nodded, though their wide eyes revealed that their young hearts still carried the image of the shadowy form. Outside the masjid, the night was calm, the stars unmoved, the streets empty, yet none of the men rushed to leave. They lingered together, sitting close, drawing strength from one another's presence. It was as though stepping outside alone felt impossible after what they had seen inside. Eventually, some began to speak of what they had witnessed. One swore he saw the eyes burning like embers. Another claimed he felt its presence brush against him, cold and heavy like a storm. Another described the sound it made, the roar that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Each man had his own experience, yet all agreed that what had happened was real, undeniable, and unforgettable. There were those whose fear turned into doubt. Why here? Why during Salah? What if it returns again? Their voices trembled and their eyes darted nervously around the masjid. But the imam reminded them, It came during Salah because the Quran was being recited. It came because it is drawn to the words of Allah. Do not think of this as a punishment, but as a reminder of the unseen world that exists around us every moment. Some men nodded firmly, their faith strengthened by his words. Others remained uneasy, their hearts still trembling, but all of them knew that they had been part of something extraordinary. They had faced the reality of the unseen, not in stories or whispers, but in front of their own eyes, in the middle of their prayer. As they finally began to leave the masjid, groups walked together, speaking quietly. Their footsteps echoed in the night, and each man felt a strange mix of fear and pride. Fear for what they had witnessed, pride that they had not broken their salah, that they had stood firm when the unseen revealed itself. That night, sleep did not come easily. Men lay awake in their homes, staring into the darkness, their minds replaying the figure again and again. Some wept in their dua, others whispered Quran until sleep overtook them. The children clung to their parents, unable to close their eyes without seeing the shadow once more. Yet in every home, hearts returned to the same truth. Allah is greater. Allah is the protector, and nothing in creation, seen or unseen, can overpower his words. From that day onward, the worshippers carried themselves differently. They entered the masjid with hearts heavy in remembrance, whispering dhikr as they stepped inside. They prayed with greater focus, knowing that their salah was not only seen by their Lord, but also observed by the unseen world. And every time the imam's voice rose in recitation, they felt both a chill of fear and a spark of strength, remembering the night when the veil was lifted and the unseen stood among them. The congregation carried the weight of that night in their hearts. But what struck them most was not the terror of the jinn's appearance. It was the way it disappeared. They had all seen the figure rise. They had all felt its presence pressing upon them, and they had all heard the strange echoes of its voice. Yet when the imam continued his recitation, when the Quran was recited with strength and certainty, the shadow could not remain. It had dissolved like smoke in the wind, as though the words of Allah had burned through its form. That moment became the turning point for every soul present. The realization that the Quran was not just guidance for life, but a shield that no unseen being could withstand. The imam himself reminded them afterward in calm words, "Did you not see how it fled when the verses of Allah rose in this masjid? Did you not feel how the weight lifted from your hearts when the remembrance of Allah grew louder? Know this, it is not we who are strong. It is the Quran. It is not our voices, but the words of Allah that make the unseen tremble." His words struck deeply because they had witnessed the truth of it with their own eyes. From that night onward, the worshippers approached their salah differently. Each takbir was heavier, each verse recited with deeper conviction. They no longer saw Quran as something recited in rhythm and routine. They saw it as a weapon, a shield of light against the darkness of the unseen. The memory of how the jinn vanished when the verses grew louder filled them with a new kind of strength. Fear still lived in their hearts, but it was overshadowed by certainty, the certainty that Allah's words could destroy fear in a heartbeat. One man later confessed to his friends, "When I saw the figure, I felt my knees buckle. I wanted to flee. But when I heard the imam reciting ayat after ayat, my heart felt as if it was being lifted out of darkness. The more he recited, the less I feared. By the time it vanished, I knew that there was no power greater than the Quran." Others nodded in agreement, for they too had felt the same. The elders of the town began telling the youth, "If ever you feel fear in the night, if ever you sense something unseen around you, do not let panic overtake you. Recite the words of Allah. Recite Surah Al-Falaq, Surah An-Nas, Ayat Al-Kursi. These are not mere sounds. These are shields sent from the Creator himself." And the youth listened more attentively than ever before, for they knew now that these were not only lessons of faith, but survival. In the homes of the worshippers, the Quran began to echo more often. Fathers would gather their families before sleep, reciting aloud so that the words would fill the walls. Mothers whispered Decca as they worked, their tongues wet with remembrance, their hearts calmer for it. Children memorized verses with new eagerness, for they had seen with their own eyes what power those verses carried. It was no longer only about reward and virtue. It was about protection from a world they now knew was very real. The Imam reminded them often, the jinn are like us, some are believers, some are not. But even those who disbelieve cannot stand against the Khan. They may appear, they may whisper, they may try to frighten you, but they cannot overcome the words of Allah. Fear only Him and hold firmly to His book. And the men nodded, their faith renewed, their hearts steadying with every reminder. The story of that night spread beyond the masjid. Travelers passing through the town heard the tale, and many stopped to ask the locals, is it true? Did the jinn really appear? And the townspeople would answer firmly, yes, it appeared. But more importantly, it disappeared. And it disappeared because the Quran was recited. Some even described the masjid as a place blessed, for it had been a witness to the triumph of Allah's words over the unseen. Children grew up with the story as part of their upbringing. They would be told, remember, my son, my daughter, if you are ever afraid, if you feel the whispers of shayateen around you, if your heart trembles in the darkness, do not call for help from men. Call upon Allah. Recite His words, for they are stronger than anything you fear. And the children listened, their eyes wide, their hearts absorbing the lesson. Over time, the fear of that night transformed into strength. Men who once walked nervously through the masjid after Isha now walked with their heads high, whispering dhikr as they entered. They knew that even if shadows flickered, even if whispers returned, the Quran would protect them. They knew that remembrance of Allah was their shield, their comfort, their weapon. The Imam himself was often asked, were you not afraid when you saw it? Did your heart not tremble? He would smile softly and reply, yes, my heart trembled. But I knew that if I stopped reciting, fear would consume us all. So I placed my trust in Allah and let His words speak. And it was His words that drove it away, not my strength. His humility left the people in awe, reminding them that protection did not come from men, but from the Lord of men. The masjid remained known for its strange presence. Some nights, worshippers still felt the unseen gathering during prayer. At times, faint sounds could still be heard, as though invisible beings were listening. But now, no one panicked, no one ran. They knew that even if the unseen drew close, it could not harm them as long as the Quran was recited, as long as their tongues remembered Allah. One man put it best when he said, that night taught us a lesson greater than any khutbah, greater than any story. We learned that fear can only live in the absence of remembrance. But where the Quran is recited, fear dies and strength rises. And so the masjid became not a place of terror, but a place of strength. It became a reminder to all who entered that the unseen is real, but so is the power of Allah's words. It became a testimony that the believer is never alone, for the Quran is his companion, his shield, his light in the darkest of nights. From that night onward, whenever the Imam raised his voice in Salah, every man in the rows behind him remembered. They remembered the shadow, they remembered the fear, and they remembered how the Khan cut through it all. And in that remembrance, their hearts found peace. The night of the jinn's appearance in the masjid was not just an event to be remembered, it became a lesson carved into the souls of those who witnessed it. For the people realized that what they saw was not simply a frightening encounter, but a reminder from Allah of the unseen world and of where true strength lies. The image of the towering shadow, the echoes of its voice, the trembling of their hearts, all of it could have left them broken in fear. But instead, what remained strongest in their memory was how the Khan defeated it, how the dhikr of Allah pushed it away, and how nothing in creation can ever overpower the words of the Creator. In the days that followed, many gathered in the masjid not to speak about fear, but to reflect on what they had learned. An elder said, "We used to think we feared the darkness, but that night we learned that fear belongs only to Allah. We saw with our own eyes that the jinn has no power before his words." Another added, "This is what our faith teaches us, to believe in the unseen. We always believed it in our hearts, but now we have tasted it with our eyes, and it has only strengthened our iman." The people began to see every act of worship with new eyes. When they raised their hands in salah, they remembered that their Lord was watching them, closer than their own veins. When they recited Quran, they no longer rushed through the words, but recited slowly, feeling the strength of each verse, knowing that these were not human words but divine speech, a shield that the unseen could not withstand. When they whispered Decca in the quiet of night, they felt their homes protected, their hearts comforted, their families surrounded by angels. The lesson of that night spread like fire. Travelers carried the story to other towns, and the message reached far beyond those who had been present. And everywhere it was told, the lesson remained the same: fear not the jinn, fear not the whispers, fear not the shadows of the night. Fear only Allah, for it is His words that protect, His remembrance that shields, and His power that defeats all others. Even the children of the town carried the lesson in their young hearts. No longer did they shiver in their beds when the night grew dark. Their parents taught them to recite Ayat al-Kursi before sleeping, to whisper Surah al-Falaq and Surah an-Nas, and to trust that these words would guard them. The boys who had seen the jinn in the masjid grew into men with unshakable faith, for they had already faced the unseen and learned that Allah alone grants safety. The Imam reminded his congregation often, "Do not think that this masjid was cursed because of what you saw. No, it was blessed. Allah chose us to witness what most people only hear about. He showed us the unseen so that our belief would no longer be in words alone, but in experience. And He showed us that the Quran is not just guidance, it is a weapon, a light, a protection. This was a mercy, not a punishment." His words lifted their spirits, reminding them to see the event not as something to fear, but as a sign of Allah's greatness. Over time, the people realized another lesson too, that the jinn are not to be blamed for every whisper of fear, nor are they all enemies. Some of them are Muslim, some are guided, and some may even stand unseen in rows of prayer. What they had seen that night was not meant to drive them to hatred of the jinn, but to remind them of their own weakness and their own need to cling to Allah for protection. The town changed after that. Men who once neglected their salah began to return to the masjid, humbled by the reminder of how close the unseen world really was. Families that had grown lax in their Quran recitation began to fill their homes with its sound. Hearts that once trembled at shadows began to beat with courage, for they knew that nothing in the darkness could harm them when Allah was with them. One man put it best when he said, "That night did not teach us to fear jinn. It taught us to fear Allah more. It taught us that fear is wasted on creation, but when directed to the Creator, it becomes strength, it becomes faith, it becomes light." And truly, this was the essence of what they had learned. The masjid itself became a symbol. People spoke of it not as the masjid where jinn appeared, but as the masjid where Allah's words proved their power. Every salah there carried an extra weight of sincerity, for the worshippers felt the unseen world closer than ever. They prayed with the certainty that angels surrounded them, that Allah was watching, and that even if the jinn gathered again, they would stand firm, for they carried the Quran as their shield. The lesson echoed through generations. Believe in the unseen, but do not fear it. Fear only Allah. Protect yourselves with His book. Let your tongues remain wet with Decca, for it is your fortress. And never forget that the world around you is filled with what you cannot see. Angels recording, jinn roaming, whispers seeking to mislead. But stronger than all of it is the remembrance of the one who created them all. As the years passed, the story remained alive. It was told in homes, in study circles, in Friday sermons. And each time it was told, the hearts of the listeners trembled, not with fear of the jinn, but with awe at the power of the Quran. Each time, people walked away with the same thought: we live surrounded by the unseen, but we are never alone. Allah is with us, His angels protect us, His words shield us, and His mercy envelops us. And so the final lesson of that night was simple but eternal. Do not fear creation, fear only the Creator. Do not let the whispers of the unseen shake your faith. Let them remind you to hold tighter to the Quran. Do not let the darkness frighten you, for the light of Allah's words is brighter than any shadow. And remember always, the one who stands firm in prayer, the one whose heart beats with daika, the one whose tongue recites Quran, that believer walks in a fortress of light that no jinn, no shaitan, and no whisper can ever break.